In this episode, we move into a topic that feels especially real in modern organizations because very little important work happens alone anymore. A company may build its own products and run its own teams, but it still depends on outside providers for software, cloud services, payment processing, logistics, legal support, managed security, data hosting, consulting, and a long list of other functions that shape daily operations. That is why third-party risk matters so much in the Certified in Risk and Information Systems Control (CRISC) perspective. A new learner might assume that risk sits mostly inside the organization's own systems and employees. But the truth is that outside relationships can create just as much exposure as internal weaknesses, and sometimes far more. Once a business gives another company access to data, systems, customers, facilities, or critical processes, it has created a dependency that can affect service delivery, compliance, resilience, and trust. Understanding how to identify and evaluate that dependency is one of the clearest ways to think like a practical risk professional. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A helpful place to begin is by defining what a third party actually is, because the category is broader than many beginners expect. A third party is any outside organization or external service provider that supports, influences, or touches the business in a meaningful way. That can include a software vendor, a payroll processor, a cloud platform, a law firm, a managed services provider, a call center, a shipping partner, a data analytics firm, or even a temporary consulting company helping with a major project. The key idea is not the industry label. The key idea is that the organization is depending on someone outside its own formal boundaries to help carry out work that matters. That matters because dependence always creates risk. If the third party fails, is compromised, mishandles information, underperforms, or changes its business in a way that affects the service, the organization that hired that third party still feels the consequences. In risk terms, the important question is not only who the provider is. It is what business objective now depends on that provider continuing to perform safely, reliably, and within agreed expectations. This becomes even more important once you see how deeply third parties are woven into modern business operations. Organizations use outside providers because specialization, speed, cost efficiency, and technical complexity make it unrealistic to do everything internally. A company might rely on a cloud platform for storage and computing, a payment service for customer transactions, a marketing provider for outreach data, and a managed security company for monitoring after business hours. Each of those decisions may be sensible and even necessary, but each one also moves part of the organization's operating reality into someone else's environment. That means risk is no longer limited to what the company directly controls. It now includes what outside parties control, how they secure their own services, how they handle outages, what subcontractors they use, how quickly they report incidents, and whether they can continue delivering under pressure. This is why third-party risk is not just procurement paperwork or legal language in a contract. It is the business risk that comes from relying on external parties for work the organization still remains accountable for when something goes wrong. A strong approach to identification begins with knowing which third parties exist and what they actually do for the business. That sounds obvious, but many organizations discover they do not have a clear picture of all their outside relationships, especially after growth, mergers, fast-moving projects, or years of decentralized purchasing. Some vendors handle low-value support services with little operational impact, while others store sensitive information, connect directly into important systems, or support functions the business could not operate without for very long. Third-party risk identification, therefore, starts with visibility. The organization needs to understand what service the provider delivers, which business process depends on it, what kind of access it has, what data it touches, whether it has network connectivity, and how critical that dependency is to business operations. Without that visibility, evaluation becomes shallow because the organization is judging vendors in the abstract instead of understanding the real exposure created by each relationship. A vendor list by itself is not enough. The real value comes from connecting each outside party to the business activity, system, data set, or service that makes the relationship meaningful. Once the organization has visibility, the next step is understanding that not every third party creates the same level of risk. Some providers are easy to replace, touch very little sensitive information, and would cause limited harm if they experienced a problem. Others may be deeply embedded in essential operations, support customer-facing services, process regulated data, or provide capabilities that are difficult to substitute quickly. This is why evaluation usually begins with some form of criticality and inherent risk thinking. A provider that supports a low-impact internal convenience tool should not be evaluated with the same intensity as a provider handling payroll, patient data, transaction processing, or identity management. The business needs to ask how serious the consequences would be if the third party failed, was unavailable, mishandled information, or delivered inaccurate results. It should also consider timing, because a service interruption that is survivable on an ordinary day may become severe during a peak sales period, a financial reporting cycle, or a sensitive operational window. Strong evaluation starts by understanding the importance of the dependency before trying to judge the details of the provider's controls. A useful way to think about evaluation is to see that third-party risk comes in several different forms, and mature assessment looks beyond cybersecurity alone. Security risk is part of the picture because vendors may expose data, provide a path into systems, or fail to protect the environments they operate. Privacy risk also matters when personal information is collected, processed, stored, or shared under legal and contractual obligations. Operational risk matters because outages, poor performance, staffing weakness, or process failures at the vendor can disrupt the organization's own services. Compliance and legal risk matter because the organization may still be held responsible for regulatory obligations even when the service is outsourced. Financial risk matters because a vendor in poor financial condition may struggle to invest, support, or even continue operating. Reputational risk matters because customers often judge the organization itself, not the vendor behind the scenes, when a service fails or sensitive data is mishandled. A strong evaluator therefore asks not only whether the provider seems secure, but whether the overall relationship creates exposure across these broader business dimensions. Before a new third party is brought into the environment, due diligence becomes one of the most important parts of identification and evaluation. Due diligence means gathering enough information to understand whether the provider is suitable for the work it is being asked to perform and whether the risk created by the relationship is acceptable. This does not mean demanding perfection from every vendor. It means understanding the basics of capability, control maturity, service reliability, business stability, incident handling, and the provider's own dependence on subcontractors or other outside services. If a vendor will handle important data or support a critical process, the organization should want to know how seriously that provider treats access control, recovery planning, resilience, employee oversight, and reporting obligations when something goes wrong. The deeper lesson for beginners is that due diligence is not a ceremony. It is the point where the organization decides whether it is walking into the relationship with open eyes or with assumptions. Blind trust is not a control, and brand recognition is not a substitute for evaluating whether a provider fits the actual risk of the service being outsourced. Contracts play a major role in third-party risk because they help translate expectations into enforceable obligations, but they are only useful when those obligations are aligned with real business needs. A weak contract may leave important questions unanswered about security responsibilities, data handling, breach notification timing, audit access, service levels, retention practices, termination rights, or how information must be returned or destroyed when the relationship ends. A stronger contract helps define what the provider is required to do, what the organization has the right to request or review, and what happens if performance or security falls below acceptable levels. Even so, risk professionals should remember that contract language is not magic. A promise on paper does not mean the provider can actually perform the obligation well under stress, and it does not remove the need for monitoring after the relationship begins. Contracts matter because they shape accountability and reduce ambiguity, But evaluation still has to ask whether the provider's real operating environment supports what the contract says. The best agreements connect legal language to operational reality instead of assuming the signature alone solves the risk. Third-party evaluation also needs to continue after onboarding, because vendor risk changes over time even when the original due diligence looked solid. A provider may change its architecture, outsource more work to another company, experience a breach, lose key personnel, expand too quickly, reduce service quality, or become more deeply embedded in the organization than anyone originally expected. The business itself may change as well, and that often changes the risk of the relationship. A tool that was once used for a low-impact purpose may later handle more sensitive information or become tied to a critical process. This is why strong third-party risk management is not a one-time approval exercise. It requires ongoing evaluation that looks at changes in service, changes in dependence, changes in incident history, and changes in control quality or business importance. Periodic review helps ensure that a vendor originally judged acceptable has not quietly become a much larger source of exposure. Without that follow-through, organizations often rely on outdated assumptions and discover too late that yesterday's minor dependency has become today's major operational risk. Another important idea is that third-party risk does not stop with the vendor you sign the contract with. Many providers depend on their own outside companies for hosting, data processing, customer support, software components, or specialized services. These outside relationships are often called fourth parties, and they matter because the organization may be indirectly depending on them even if their names never appear in the original business discussion. A cloud-based service may rely on another hosting provider. A managed service may rely on subcontractors in different countries. A payment processor may depend on several other platforms to keep transactions moving. This layered dependence creates complexity because the organization can feel the impact of a fourth-party failure without having direct visibility or control over that underlying relationship. Concentration risk adds another layer to this problem. If many critical services depend on the same external platform, region, or provider family, a single outage or business failure can affect multiple parts of the organization at once. Good evaluation, therefore, asks not only who the direct vendor is, but how far the dependency chain extends and whether too much exposure has quietly accumulated in one external point of failure. When evaluating third parties, evidence matters, but evidence has to be interpreted carefully. A vendor may provide assessments, reports, policy summaries, security statements, resilience materials, service performance information, or other forms of assurance that help the organization judge the relationship. These can be useful, but they should not be treated as perfect proof that the provider is safe in every meaningful sense. The real question is whether the evidence helps the organization understand how the vendor operates and whether the vendor's controls, oversight, and response capabilities fit the importance of the service being outsourced. A glossy document or a standard questionnaire response may create confidence, but it may say very little about how the provider performs under pressure, how quickly it detects problems, or how transparent it will be during a real incident. Strong evaluation, therefore, requires judgment. The organization should ask whether the evidence is current, relevant to the actual service, and sufficient for the level of dependency involved. It is not about collecting the most paper. It is about understanding whether the available information actually supports trust in a business relationship that could affect important objectives. There are several common mistakes that weaken third-party risk identification and evaluation, and they are worth noticing because they appear often in both practice and exam scenarios. One mistake is assuming that large or well-known vendors are automatically safe enough to trust without deeper review. Another is assuming that a certification, report, or standard statement from the vendor settles the matter even when the business dependency is unusually critical. Some organizations evaluate vendors only at onboarding and then treat the relationship as stable forever, even though services, threats, and dependencies keep changing. Others focus only on security questions while ignoring resilience, legal obligations, exit planning, financial condition, or the danger of relying too heavily on one provider. A very common misconception is believing that outsourcing a service means outsourcing the risk itself. In truth, the work may move, but accountability stays close to home. Customers, regulators, executives, and boards usually look first to the organization that chose the vendor, not to the vendor that failed behind the scenes. Recognizing these traps helps learners develop a more realistic and disciplined view of third-party exposure. Ownership and governance are what keep this topic from becoming scattered across too many departments. Procurement may help establish the relationship. Legal may help shape the contract. Security may review technical safeguards. Privacy teams may look at data handling. Business leaders may know the operational dependency, and risk teams may coordinate the overall evaluation. All of those perspectives matter, but someone still needs to make sure the relationship has a clearly identified owner and that the resulting exposure is visible in the organization's broader risk picture. A business owner may need to decide whether the service is worth the remaining exposure. A control owner may need to ensure ongoing review activities happen consistently. Governance groups may need reporting on critical vendors, stalled remediation, rising concentration risk, or providers whose current posture no longer aligns with business expectations. This is where third-party risk connects directly back to the rest of CRISC. Identification and evaluation are not separate from risk response and reporting. They feed those activities by making external dependencies visible enough for the business to assign ownership, choose treatment, and monitor whether the relationship still fits within acceptable limits. By the end of this discussion, the main lesson should be clear that third-party risk identification and evaluation is about understanding how outside relationships can affect the organization's objectives, obligations, resilience, and trustworthiness. It begins with visibility into who the third parties are and what they actually support, then moves into criticality, due diligence, contract understanding, ongoing review, and honest judgment about what remains outside the organization's direct control. Strong evaluation looks beyond security alone and considers operational, privacy, legal, financial, reputational, and concentration risks as part of the same business picture. It also recognizes that outsourcing work does not outsource accountability, and that vendors must be monitored as living dependencies rather than approved once and forgotten. This is why the topic matters so much in Domain 3. It teaches you to see external partners not just as helpful providers, but as part of the organization's real risk environment. When you can identify and evaluate those relationships clearly, you are helping the business make more disciplined decisions about trust, dependency, and the exposure it is prepared to carry.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.